Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 12 running back rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're talking about all subjects related to the running back position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses are giving up the most points to opposing running backs thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format in order to give ourselves some more insight as to who has the most advantageous matchups going into this upcoming week, and of course, how we could take advantage of that and which players have potentially more upside based on their upcoming matchup. After I present all that information, of course, we'll transition to our top 36 running back rankings on the week, as I'll share with you guys my perspective and opinion and the statistics that justify my reasoning as to why I think the running back position is going to stack up as such when all is said and done by the end of week 12. Now, before we begin today's video, for those of you who have not yet already subscribed to the channel, we're making fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2021 season. Earlier today, we already put out our tight end rankings for the week. Tomorrow, we'll talk about wide receivers and quarterbacks, and Thursday morning at 7:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time until 9:30 a.m., which will be the kickoff of the Detroit Lions versus Chicago Bears game. I will be live streaming, answering questions for those of you who need to get your lineup set before the Thursday games. And then we'll once again live stream on Sunday morning, as we typically do, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So again, if you're trying to stay up to date and of course help yourself win a 2021 fantasy football championship, be sure to subscribe. Of course, click the bell notification button to stay up to date on my latest content. Outside of that, if you guys haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy, again, there's a lot of fun to be had there, whether it is the upcoming Thursday night contest, the sophomores versus juniors, rest of season best ball drafts that you can have for the NFL season, where you're only drafting second and third year players in the pool. You can go ahead and build some rosters that, yes, are young, but could have some incredible fantasy upside for the rest of the season and win yourself up to $10,000 if you win the first place. Again, if you sign up today using promo code Andrew, Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. Again, the link is down in the description for those of you who are interested in playing either NFL contest, NBA, NHL, all of the above there. Play fantasy the Underdog way. Thank you very much. Reminder before we begin, again, do not forget rankings are subject to change. I say it every single episode because, again, when we're talking about the running back position on a Tuesday, there's a lot of things that could change before Thursday night's games and, of course, Sunday's games, whether it is a various amount of injuries. The players I will be mentioning today, some of them are perhaps not even going to play this week, like, for example, a Cordarrelle Patterson, maybe even Elijah Mitchell, they may be out, but I wanted to mention them, and I will obviously present some other players in their respective backfields and where I kind of have in mind where I'm going to play them if, in fact, their respective starters, like those two that I mentioned, aren't going to play. Either way, do not forget, there are timestamps down in the description. Everything that we talk about is for a half PPR scoring format, meaning everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a full PPR or a standard league. Let's get into talking about matchups before we get into our top 36 rankings. And let's begin by presenting to you guys how many points defenses are giving up to opposing running backs thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format. On the very left side of the screen, we have 2021 running back fantasy points allowed. As you can see, the New York Jets, followed by the Detroit Lions, Los Angeles Chargers, Seattle Seahawks, Atlanta Falcons, are giving up the most points to opposing running backs thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format. Of course, we know you want to start all of your running backs against these respective teams, and we've seen it week over week since the beginning of the season that these teams cannot stop the run respectively. Now, some of them may be better than others, and some of them may give up a lot of points through the air, which is why I wanted to present the stats next to that, the 2021 running back rush stats allowed, which gives us a representation as to how many points are scored on the ground via rushing stats, only yardage and touchdowns against these opposing teams. Now, similar to the list on the very left, the New York Jets, Los Angeles Chargers, Detroit Lions, Houston Texans, 49ers, these are still teams that are giving up a bunch of points on the ground from rushing statistics alone, which excludes any sort of PPR upside reception work and yardage, etc. But now that I've presented these statistics, of course, just want to give you more perspective as to what exactly we are to potentially go after this upcoming week based on matchups. Of course, you want to play Houston Texans running backs if you're in a bind this upcoming week against the New York Jets. You, of course, want to play David Montgomery against the Detroit Lions defense. That is obviously going to be an automatic start there. The Los Angeles Chargers, they'll have their hands full trying to hold down their former running back, Melvin Gordon, and, of course, Javonte Williams, the rookie sensation, who may have a breakout game this upcoming week. The Seattle Seahawks, they'll, of course, have to take on J.D. McKissic, Antonio Gibson. The Atlanta Falcons will have to stop James Robinson. There is a lot of RB talent at the top of this list who will have incredible matchups. It's just purely a matter of whether or not all of these specific dominoes fall in the right direction and these players find themselves the opportunity and the success this upcoming week. Either way, Now that we've talked about this, you can go ahead and check this guy out overall. I will be referring back to these statistics as we kind of progress through our rankings because we all know how much of an importance matchups play throughout the given week. All right, now that we've covered that, let's go ahead and transition to our top 36 running back rankings for week 12 of the 2021 fantasy football season. We'll go ahead and begin with the new king of the fantasy football kingdom, Jonathan Taylor. That's correct. Many people used to call Derrick Henry King Henry, but I'm going to go ahead and stop doing so until he returns, because at this current moment in time, Jonathan Taylor is the king of fantasy football, coming off of a week in which he had 51.9 fantasy points, 5 touchdowns, 185 rushing yards against the Buffalo Bills defense. We just talked about matchups a minute ago. You guys remember that the Buffalo Bills were giving up the fewest points to running backs for maybe the first 9 weeks of the season consistently. And all of a sudden, they're in the middle of the pack because of a huge dent that Jonathan Taylor impacted on their defense. They could not stop him. And either way, regardless of who Jonathan Taylor is playing this week, we are firing him up. And that is why I wanted to go ahead and put him at number 1. Though he takes on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, yes, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they're giving up the fewest fantasy points per game to running backs via rushing stats, about almost 8 fantasy points per game. So if we were to expect anything, like 80 yards would be the only thing that Jonathan Taylor was going to get. That's not the expectation. Jonathan Taylor is far better than that. This team is predicated on running the ball. Their offensive line has been dominating defenses. Jonathan Taylor, obviously a must start, but just wanted to go ahead and give him his respect that is absolutely needed after that incredible performance. Many of you may have been Jonathan Taylored via, you played against them, or many of you benefited from JT carrying your squad. I would be one of those. All right, moving on. Our number 2 for this week is Christian McCaffrey of the Carolina Panthers, taking on the Miami Dolphins. Not really worried about the matchup. I think out of all these running backs in the National Football League, of course, the top of the top are typically matchup proof, and that is the case for Christian McCaffrey. In the 4 games this season that he has played more than 60% of the offensive snaps, he's averaging 21.97 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. With only 6 games played, Christian McCaffrey is still the number 23 overall running back in terms of total fantasy points. That is an unbelievable statistic, and we all know he is as good as he's ever been. The fact that Cam Newton is there just gives him more potential upside. Of course, Cam Newton getting a nice little 20-yard rushing touchdown will certainly impact Christian McCaffrey's value. But as long as the guy is getting the ball, 7 times out of the backfield, the receiving yards are there, the receiving touchdowns are there, he's always going to have the rushing work on the ground. Christian McCaffrey, an automatic play every single week, regardless of who he's playing against. Moving on to Dalvin Cook, our number 3. Again, I talked about it last week. When you're giving a running back of this caliber elite level opportunities always going to lead to success in fantasy football, and that's exactly been the case. In the last 2 weeks, he's had 27 touches and 25 touches in the last 2 respective games. As long as this man is going to be given 22 touches on the ground, 4 targets, 3 receptions through the air, of course he is going to get himself an efficient amount of points, and the yardage is only going to pile on. Rushing touchdowns are always going to be there on the table for the Minnesota Vikings offense, as they've taken steps forward giant steps forward in the last couple weeks in terms of improving their offense from a team that could barely score against the Dallas Cowboys to being a team that is honestly in the first half blowing out the Green Bay Packers and then closing it out with a 34-point total performance as an offense there. Dalvin Cook in a fantastic position taking on the 49ers. They give up the 5th most points on the ground to opposing running backs. Dalvin Cook should be a fantastic play. Austin Ekeler, another running back this last week. You either got Ekeler or you benefited from Ekeler's unbelievable 38.5 fantasy point performance. Now, of course, the 11 rushing attempts that led to 50 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns is great. We love to see that, especially considering a lot of people in the offseason or in the last couple years have kept saying Austin Ekeler's not a goal line back. He's not going to get the touch. Come on. This man has scored over 10 touchdowns this season. And not to mention, the receiving work is unbelievable. 6 catches, 65 yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. I had a league this last week in which I have Justin Herbert and Austin Ekeler getting double points on that. That's what you call a pure stack of points. Either way, going into this upcoming week, they take on the Denver Broncos. Yeah, it may be a difficult matchup, but am I worried about it? Absolutely not. We're talking about the current RB2 in fantasy football. A guy that's averaging 19.83 fantasy points per game. A guy that in the last 3 games against the Denver Broncos, respectively, has scored 14.3, 14.7, and 14.8 fantasy points. Overall, it's going to be a fantastic matchup, and I think Austin Ekeler is ready for the challenge ahead. Moving on to David Montgomery, our number 5. Again, I am on the David Montgomery train, especially considering the fact that he takes on the Detroit Lions this week, giving up the second most points to opposing running backs this season. Again, just recently, Nick Chubb, 130 rushing yards against them. Najee Harris, 105, got a touchdown called back. The Philadelphia Eagles offense ran for 144 rushing yards amongst their running backs, whether it was Howard, Scott, Gainwell. They ran all over them. There's a lot of opportunity to be had. And though David Montgomery's coming off of an unfortunate week of only 7.2 fantasy points, I mean, just the offense as a whole for the Chicago Bears, I mean, they didn't do anything really productive until the end of that game against the Baltimore Ravens. In fact, they didn't have a single rushing attempt inside the 15-yard line this last week. So, of course, David Montgomery wasn't even close to sniffing out a touchdown. But when you play against the Detroit Lions, let's talk about, David Montgomery's recent performances. Specifically, going back to the 2020 season, David Montgomery was able to put up 22.6 fantasy points, and then earlier this year, 25.1 fantasy points. A lot of productivity as of late against the Detroit Lions defense that cannot stop a soul. David Montgomery should be a fantastic automatic start. Moving on to Najee Harris, a running back that, though we all thought he was concussed in that game, was able to come back, find himself a rushing touchdown, and get himself 14.4 total fantasy points. And though it wasn't the most efficient night in terms of running on the ground due to the game script on Sunday, of course, the Pittsburgh Steelers had to go ahead and pass the ball for majority of that second half. It wasn't until the mistakes of the Los Angeles Chargers giving up incredible field positioning to the Steelers that Najee Harris was able to come in, jump over the pile, and score a touchdown. This upcoming week, he takes on the Cincinnati Bengals. The last time we saw him take on the Cincinnati Bengals, well, of course, he had himself that unbelievable game in week 3 in which, yes, he only had 14 carries for 40 yards, but had 19 targets, 14 receptions, 102 receiving yards, and 21.2 fantasy points. I'm not saying that's ever going to happen again. It most likely won't. There's a reason why that is extremely rare for any player, much less a running back. But going into this week, again, we are coming off of a couple weeks in which running backs have succeeded against the Cincinnati Bengals. Nick Chubb, 163 all-purpose yards and 2 touchdowns, along with Michael Carter, 172 all-purpose yards and a touchdown, while Ty Johnson in that game also had himself a lot of success on the through the air, and a receiving touchdown. There's a lot of potential to be had, and though Josh Jacobs wasn't able to enact on it this last week, I think Najee Harris, of all running backs, will certainly be able to against Cincinnati. DeAndre Swift is our number 7. DeAndre Swift has been absolutely insane. And, he plays against Chicago. Though last season he didn't find much success against that defense, I think this year it'll be a little bit different with Khalil Mack out and the Bears middle linebacker Danny Trevathan having a season-ending injured reserve stint here. Of course, there's a potential to run the ball on this defense, especially how well DeAndre Swift has looked as of late. But either way, in terms of how many points the Chicago Bears are giving up to running backs, only the 17th most, but in terms of what they've recently given up, 17 points to Devonta Freeman this last week. Elijah Mitchell put up 19.7 points against them. Najee Harris, 15.3. Leonard Fournette, 16.0. I mean, when we're talking about a running back like DeAndre Swift, who has had back-to-back games of 130 rushing yards, he's had 7 performances of 15-plus fantasy points this season, and in the last 2 weeks, he's had 53 total touches. I mean, can we ask for anything more? The momentum's continuing to build, and the likelihood of Jared Goff starting is probably pretty high this week, but they're going to continue to pound the rock and give this man the ball. I think he was averaging 8-9 yards per carry last week. I understand he had a 50-yard touchdown, but that's all skill continuing to build. And when you're able to run the ball as successfully as they were able to against Cleveland of all defenses, I mean, I don't think there's any matchup that I'm afraid of with DeAndre Swift, considering how much work we've seen him do on the ground as of late and how successful he's been through the air, considering he leads all running backs in receptions this season. Moving on to our number 8, we have Joe Mixon. Now, talking about another running back that has been absolutely on fire. In 4 out of the last 5 weeks, Joe Mixon has put up 23-plus fantasy points. That is unbelievable. I mean, in terms of overall productivity, efficiency, finding the end zone, Joe Mixon has just been unstoppable. And can we ask for anything more? Absolutely not. This upcoming week, he gets a very, controversial is probably the right term here, matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers. They're currently giving up the 13th most points to running backs based off of course, Austin Eckler's incredible, 38.5 point fantasy point performance. But let's put this into account. Through the first 11 weeks of the 2021 season, the Pittsburgh Steelers have given up 1,021 rushing yards total. They've also given up 4.71 yards per carry to opposing running backs. That is an unbelievable statistic. And when I think of what Joe Mixon's been able to do as of late, running the ball, 30 times this last week against the Las Vegas Raiders, didn't even need to concern himself with catching the ball out of the backfield. This man was just handed the rock, and he just ran over this defense consistently. As long as this team is continuing to just plow through respective defenses, when you go up against the Pittsburgh Steelers, of course, they may get a couple pieces back, and that certainly did hurt them last week, not having a Hayden Fitzpatrick out there, TJ Watt. But if they're going to be missing some pieces this week, Joe Mixon is going to be able to run through that with a full head of steam. Considering the recent performances, the momentum is pretty much an avalanche going in that direction. Moving on, we have number 9, Ezekiel Elliott. He did fully practice today. That is what I want to first and foremost mention, because that is of the utmost importance. Now, he gets to take on the Las Vegas Raiders, giving up the 7th most points to opposing running backs. Like I just mentioned with Joe Mixon, coming off a week in which he had 30 carries for 132 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns, there's a lot of potential to be had here. Now, obviously, the last couple performances, I'd say the last month of Ezekiel Elliott's season have not been great. Mainly because this last week, of course, Kansas City left the game with an injury, came back, the game script wasn't great, got himself 6 catches on 6 targets. But of course, the offensive line hasn't been healthy with Tyron Smith out. The left side of the offensive line has pretty much been decimated. And on the right side, you got Zach Martin getting his ass kicked the entire game by Chris Jones. Nonetheless, a couple weeks prior to that, of course, the game scripts haven't been great against Denver. Of course, when you had Cooper Rush at the quarterback position, they weren't able to effectively run the ball as people were just stacking the box against them when they played against Minnesota. So as of late, hasn't been great. But now that you get back on track, hopefully with a win this upcoming Thursday, they're going to be running the ball consistently against the Las Vegas Raiders. That is the way to succeed, and the Cowboys have to establish the run, and that's what they're going to do. Get Zeke in the end zone, get him some fantasy points, and get us back on track. Moving on to number 10, A.J. Dillon. A.J. Dillon's a fantastic running back. Let's be honest. Going up against the Los Angeles Rams this week may be a little bit of a test, but I'm not too worried about it. With Aaron Jones out for another week here, A.J. Dillon has himself a great opportunity to be, not only just the guy that is going to have the goal line work, run the ball upwards of 15 times on the ground, but he's going to get himself involved in the receiving game. In the last 2 weeks, the man has had himself 8 targets, 8 catches. That kind of efficiency is great, especially coming off a week against Minnesota, which he had 6 catches on 6 targets for 44 yards. That continues to increase his overall baseline of production. And now that you go up against a team like the Los Angeles Rams, who have been great in terms of stopping the run at times, unless you're playing against the 49ers, of course, when there's a team like the 49ers that have a fullback that comes out on the first play and pancakes the middle linebacker reader for the Los Angeles Rams, the game's over. I don't know if the Green Bay Packers are at that level, considering they're losing another offensive lineman to a season-ending ACL injury. I know Bakhtiari's not back. He had himself a knee scope. That offensive line's a little banged up, and that is why A.J. Dillon's a little bit lower, but we know that his potential is certainly in that top 5 region, and his baseline of receiving work will at least get him into this top 10 conversation. Moving on to Nick Chubb, our number 11. Now, Nick Chubb currently sits here because of my anticipation of Kareem Hunt returning to the lineup. If that's going to be the case, we all know how great Kareem Hunt has been this season already. In the first 5 games of the season, this man was averaging 16.98 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. So, of course, his overall contributions to this team, his presence is going to impact Nick Chubb's overall potential. And considering they're taking on the Baltimore Ravens, not the easiest matchup in the world, but something that obviously Nick Chubb has found success in the last couple seasons. The last time he played against the Baltimore Ravens late in the 2020 season, he had himself 82 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. If there's a potential in which we see another one of these higher scoring matchups between these two teams, of course, Nick Chubb is going to succeed. But either way, this offense is predicated on running the ball, getting into the play action scheme. But the reason why I have Nick Chubb at 11 rather than a little bit higher is, of course, Kareem Hunt, who we will be mentioning in ranking later today. Moving on to our number 12, we have James Robinson taking on the Atlanta Falcons. Again, you want to talk about defenses giving up just total yardage to running backs. Atlanta's been doing that as of late and in bunches. Specifically, the New England Patriots, 22 carries, 125 yards. Dallas, 31 carries, 103 yards. New Orleans, 24 carries, 105 yards. Carolina, 38 carries, 138 on the ground. Yes, those are a lot of carries, but mainly because these teams are just blowing out the Atlanta Falcons. And they're just running the ball heavily in the second half and killing clock. So when I look at this matchup this upcoming week, I think to myself, well, of course, James Robinson's probably not going to be in a blowout scenario, but they'll certainly be close enough to where he's consistently running the ball, getting the ample opportunity, and succeeding. Again, he's coming off of another week in which he had a rushing touchdown, over 10 fantasy points, and that's pretty much the baseline of what he's going to potentially see every single week henceforth based on how easy his schedule is. I think Robinson's a fantastic play this week, and that is why we have him as our number 12. Moving on to the RB2 conversation, we begin with Cordarrelle Patterson. My assumption is that he plays. If he doesn't, well, by all means, we're avoiding the running back position because I don't think we want to play Quadre Ollison against the Jaguars. I don't think we want to play any running back outside of Cordarrelle Patterson this week or in any of the following weeks for the Atlanta Falcons. Unless it's Cordarrelle, I don't really want to mess with it. So let's talk about Cordarrelle Patterson and his potential upside going into this matchup. Between weeks 2 through 9 of the 2021 fantasy football season, this man had 66 rushing attempts, 36 receptions, 7 total touchdowns, 670 total all-purpose yards on the ground, in the offense, not, counting special teams, and he was averaging 18.14 fantasy points per game. I mean, he was an absolute machine. And we're not going to forget about him anytime soon. Of course, he's going to come back healthy, and hopefully this week, based on what we saw last week, of course, it was a short week going into that Thursday night game. He was limited throughout the week, but there wasn't an indication as to whether or not he was going to an injured reserve or anything, because I don't think that the injury is severe enough to knock him out for an automatic 3 weeks. This is something that is hopefully going to heal within, that 1 week of rest, or perhaps maybe takes another week, and then we'll see him in week 13. But hopefully he'll be ready to go in an incredible matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are giving up the 14th most points to opposing running backs. Moving on to Saquon Barkley, our thumbnail for today's video. Saquon Barkley takes on the Eagles. And the reason why I'm excited about the potential for Saquon mainly has to do with a couple scenarios. Number one, against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers on Monday Night Football yesterday, he obviously wasn't given much opportunity. 6 rushing attempts on the ground, 6 targets through the air. Was able to at least catch every single target, have himself 12 total touches for 8.6 fantasy points. His overall opportunity isn't what I'm excited about. It's the potential that, yes, they had him limited and now are potentially going to unleash him for the rest of the year. And there's other news. Jason Garrett officially fired as the offensive coordinator for the New York Giants. The man who will be stepping in for him is Freddie Kitchens as the interim offensive coordinator. Freddie Kitchens, formerly of the Cleveland Browns. I mean, the last time we saw him, of course, lead an offense and be the coordinator there, he was able to get Nick Chubb, a lot of work in that regard. I mean, Nick Chubb in that season was averaging 18.6 rushing attempts per game, 94 rushing yards per game, and 0.5 rushing touchdowns per game. If you're going to go ahead and potentially give that kind of opportunity to a running back like Saquon rest of the way here, especially going up against a great matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles, I think the sky's the limit for Saquon Barkley, and that's why we have him at 14 and on the thumbnail. Moving on, Antonio Gibson taking on the Seattle Seahawks. Now I understand Antonio Gibson only had himself 19 total rushing attempts this last week. 20 would have been the key number, especially considering he had 2 rushing attempts from inside the 6-yard line. Just give him another one there. Hopefully he punches it in and pretty much makes himself a successful overall fantasy prospect, but unfortunately wasn't the case. Going into this upcoming week, I understand the Seattle Seahawks matchup is one of the easiest at the position, and there's a reason why. James Conner, 18.4 fantasy points this last week. A.J. Dillon, 25.8 the week prior. Alvin Kamara, 28.9 a couple weeks ago on that Thursday night game. There's a lot of potential here, and there's a lot of points to be had from a respective running back against this defense. But I do expect J.D. McKissic to be utilized, maybe a little bit of Jarrett Patterson. Of course, we've seen Antonio Gibson fumble quite a lot this season already, and hopefully that's not going to reduce his overall opportunity. But as long as Antonio Gibson is given the 17, 18 touches against Seattle, he's going to find success. It's just too easy of a matchup for him not to. Moving on to number 16, Leonard Fournette. He takes on the toughest matchup at the running back position. The Indianapolis Colts are giving up the fewest points to opposing running backs. The fact that Ronald Jones is getting more work and gets himself a rushing touchdown this last week is a bit concerning. But at least the only thing really Leonard Fournette is an automatic for right now is receiving work. The man is coming off of multiple games in which he's getting 4 or 5 plus receptions per game. As long as he continues to do that, his baseline of total touches and opportunity and overall floor of production in fantasy, it's just going to be fantastic. And you just really can't argue with it. As long as he's getting these receptions, which always are going to be there, considering how much of a part of this offense he's been, and of course, how Tom Brady functions, he's pretty much becoming the James White of this offense to an extent. Though typically you would have thought Giovanni Bernard would be there. Having, playoff Lenny, a 3-down back, dominate up and down the field, just makes it that much easier to not only start him in fantasy, but trust that he's going to have himself an upside week. Moving on to Darrell Henderson at number 17. The last time, again, the Los Angeles Rams played against the Green Bay Packers was in the 2020 NFL playoffs. And specifically, what they wanted to do in that game was establish the run. That's why they gave Cam Akers the ball 18 times on the ground. Now, how does this potentially impact this upcoming week's matchup? Because that's how you're going to beat the Green Bay Packers offense if you are the Los Angeles Rams. You want to keep the ball out of Aaron Rodgers' hands because he absolutely can put some damage in on your respective secondary. And if that's going to be the case, you're going to be in trouble trying to have to come back on this team. If you run the ball consistently, I know Matthew Stafford has his own respective experience against the Green Bay Packers, playing against them for, 10 plus years over there in the NFC North. But if you go ahead and run the ball, keep the ball away from Aaron Rodgers, and just continue to just run the basics, they'll be fine. But when they get into these negative game scripts and Darrell Henderson disappears similar to the way that they did against the 49ers prior to their bye week, then we get in a little bit of trouble. Hopefully Darrell Henderson has kind of healed up from the injuries that he sustained in the last couple weeks and is ready to go because a lot of opportunity will be knocking on his door this week. Moving on to Kareem Hunt, our number 18. I mentioned that I was going to be referring to him. Takes on the Baltimore Ravens. Luckily for Kareem Hunt, he has been an unstoppable force this season prior to his injury from weeks 1 through 5, 16.98 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. Not to mention, last season in 2020, week 14 against the Baltimore Ravens, 33 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown, 7 catches, 77 yards, 1 receiving touchdown, 26 total fantasy points. Kareem Hunt is such a huge part of this offense, and I cannot wait for them to utilize him and at least kind of send this Cleveland offense back in the right direction. Scoring 13 points against the Detroit Lions is a joke. And I understand Baker Mayfield's got a broken humerus and he's got a dislocated shoulder issue. That's always, or what is it, a torn labrum, something of that extent. I understand that's going to affect him, especially if even if it's not on his throwing arm. It's a lot of pain management. But with Kareem Hunt back here in the backfield, I think it's going to potentially set them back to where they were from weeks 1 through 5, running over all these teams, and even against the Baltimore Ravens in an advantageous position. Moving on to our number 19, we have Miles Sanders. Made his first kind of appearance since, of course, going to the injured reserve. Had himself 16 carries, 94 yards against the New Orleans Saints. This is the second time in the last 2 years that he's had a great performance on the ground against the New Orleans Saints. I'm not really too worried about Miles Sanders, considering, of course, the likelihood of Jordan Howard missing this upcoming week is relatively high. On top of the fact that Kenneth Gainwell was an inactive last week. So it pretty much just leaves Miles Sanders, Boston Scott, and of course Jalen Hurts, the 3 rushing threats on this offense. And with that being said, he's coming off a week in which he has 16 rushing attempts, 1 total target. If the targets continue to increase, the rushing attempts are going to be there, of course, because of how much this team wants to run the ball, and they have been successfully doing so for the last couple weeks. I think Miles Sanders is in a great position, specifically on top of the fact that he's playing against the New York Giants, giving up the 6th most points to opposing running backs. Out of all the running backs in the National Football League, I think he's the only running back with 90 plus total touches and no touchdowns. It's an insane number. 98 total touches, no touchdowns. I think this is the week Miles Sanders scores. Moving on to Mark Ingram, our number 20 overall running back. As it currently stands, I do not expect Alvin Kamara to play this upcoming week. It is a short week. He didn't play on Sunday. My expectation is that he doesn't play. On top of it, Mark Ingram didn't practice today. As per, expectation, he doesn't need to practice on a Tuesday. It's more like he could just pretty much be limited the entire week, maybe even not even practice the whole week because they know they're going to have to run the ball in order to win against the Buffalo Bills. The Buffalo Bills are probably really upset about how that entire Jonathan Taylor incident went. They got really torched on the ground and they could not stop them in any sort of capacity. So I'm sure they're coming out with a potential chip on their shoulder in order to deliver a message to Mark Ingram. But with that said, the biggest upside for Mark Ingram is hoping that his right and left tackle are going to be active this week. If they're not, then we'll probably see similar numbers to last week, about 12 fantasy points, no touchdown. And that's why we have him at number 20, because I think that's the kind of range that we could potentially see him at against the Buffalo Bills team. Obviously, if there's a touchdown to be had, Mark Ingram has incredible upside, but we'll have to wait and see what the status of Kamara is, the right and left tackle is, and what exactly Mark Ingram's dealing with. If, in fact, his absence today is incorporated with an injury rather than just him resting. We'll see. Moving on to Myles Gaskin, number 21. I got to mention a couple things. The Carolina Panthers have given up already 1,070 rushing yards this season. The only difference as to why they're only giving up the third fewest points to opposing running backs this season in the National Football League is because they've given up relatively nothing through the air. I think they've only given up 248 receiving yards and like 1 receiving touchdowns this season and only 5 rushing touchdowns. In comparison to a lot of other teams, 5 rushing touchdowns is a very small number in comparison to the Jets that have given up 18 on the ground. Either way, when I talk about Myles Gaskin, I have confidence in him, obviously coming off of a 17-point fantasy performance, but mainly because in the last 3 weeks, he's been the number 16 overall running back and has touched the ball 67 times out of this backfield. If he's going to be given workhorse opportunity, the man is going to deliver workhorse numbers, and that is what we've seen in the last couple weeks and what I expect to continue to see this upcoming week. Moving on to Damien Harris at number 22. Many of you may have been concerned about Rhamondre Stevenson's usage on Thursday night against the Atlanta Falcons. Let's just put it in perspective. Rhamondre Stevenson touched the ball 3 times in the first half. Okay, if we're not going to see Rhamondre Stevenson, be that early down guy, and especially in the first half of games, and is only going to be the garbage time second string running back, then of course Damien Harris is a top 20 running back. Now he'll take on the Tennessee Titans, who are giving up the 4th fewest points to opposing running backs this season. It's not the easiest matchup, and of course Damien Harris is going to be asked to do a lot, but I think everything is there and in line for him to have himself a successful week here. Damien Harris is a running back that is obviously a goal line threat. This team wants to continue to run the ball, use 2 tight end sets, and impose their will by running the ball, hitting the other team with play action, rinse, repeat. That is exactly what this offense is, and I expect Damien Harris to be the hammer this upcoming week in the entire scheme. Moving on, we have Elijah Mitchell as our number 23. If he ends up playing this week, he's in a good position. Again, for those of you who had Jeff Wilson and are wondering about Jeff Wilson, last week Jimmy G had a wide open pass to him in the first quarter. Literally overthrew him. Otherwise, we have a 13-point fantasy week for Jeff Wilson. Nobody's complaining. But the only issue as to whether or not I have Elijah Mitchell at number 23 or maybe even higher is Deebo Samuel. I'm not even worried about Jeff Wilson. Deebo Samuel has been a plague on the running backs of the 49ers for the last couple weeks. Deebo Samuel in the last 2 games has had 13 rushing attempts that have led to 115 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. In terms of rushing statistics alone, he's the number 19 overall running back. And the running backs that are included in that list get to benefit from receiving yards. Just to put it in perspective, just how good Deebo has been out of this backfield. And as long as that is going to be the case, that is obviously going to potentially impact Mitchell's upside. And as long as that's going to be there, just like we saw against the Los Angeles Rams, Mitchell can run the ball 27 times for 97 yards. But if there's not a rushing touchdown accompanied by that or, receiving work, his upside's limited. And that is why we have him at 23. In a pretty good matchup this week, yes. But again, Deebo making an impact. Moving on, Melvin Gordon, our number 24. Melvin Gordon has been incredibly consistent. Has a very easy matchup against the 3rd easiest matchup at the position, the Los Angeles Chargers, his former team. From weeks 8 through 10, Melvin Gordon was the number 9 overall running back in fantasy, scoring a touchdown in 3 consecutive weeks. Of course, they wanted a bye week this last week, and the question remains, is he going to have himself another one of these great revenge games against his former team? I expect him to do so, but he is practically splitting snaps 50-50 with Javonte Williams. If it becomes a scenario in which Javonte Williams scores that touchdown and Melvin Gordon doesn't, the risk ensues. But either way, the fact that he has had so much success this season, the fact that they have a great matchup and this team is a run-first squad, leads me to believe Melvin Gordon is in a fantastic position. Moving on, let's talk about the RB3 category, beginning with Devonta Freeman. Regardless of who's at the quarterback position, Devonta Freeman is succeeding. In 4 out of the last 5 games, he has scored a touchdown. In the last 3 games, overall, he's the number 13 overall fantasy running back in terms of fantasy points scored in a half PPR scoring format. Coming off a week in which he had 6 targets, 6 receptions, the most that he has seen this season. The fact that Latavius Murray returned last week, and also Le'Veon Bell was cut last week, there's a lot of potential in which Devonta Freeman keeps this job because Latavius Murray's return only led to 10 rushing attempts and 30 rushing yards. Not the most efficient overall. So as long as Devonta Freeman's the lead back of this team, we know how much value that leads in fantasy. The Ravens starting running back is an automatic RB2 at times. I'm wondering to see what we're going to end up kind of pursuing this week. Obviously got himself a rushing touchdown, but if that's not there, we're in a little bit of trouble. And if Lamar Jackson's, stealing a touchdown, running it in, that could also be a little bit problematic. Moving on, we have Josh Jacobs on number 26. I put him here out of pure respect because in 3 out of the last 4 weeks, he has had less than 10 rushing attempts. And that is all I really want to talk about him, because yes, he takes on the Dallas Cowboys, and sure, he may have himself a potential to score some points here. I think this may be a one-sided affair. And if the Dallas Cowboys are coming out and firing on all cylinders and able to score, then of course it's going to put Josh Jacobs and his priority in terms of getting opportunities on the back burner. And it's not going to be something that the Las Vegas Raiders are going to lead with. And if that's going to be the case, we've seen it multiple times this season, Josh Jacobs completely disappears. And I'm not really sure if I want to be starting that kind of a running back as a top 25 guy, but I'll take him as a 26. I can live with the idea of him maybe scoring a touchdown and getting me like 9 to 10 points. Moving on to Javonte Williams at number 27. I talked about it with Melvin Gordon. They're practically splitting snaps 50-50. And as long as that is going to be the case, Javonte Williams has a lot of upside. The reason why I've been banging the table for Javonte Williams for so long is this backstretch of games, weeks 12 through 17, are incredible matchups for the Denver Broncos. Of course, a couple weeks back against Dallas, Javonte Williams went for over 100 yards, had himself a rushing touchdown called back. Tragedy, but nonetheless, when rookies come off of bye weeks, specifically going back to the 2020 season, we saw J.K. Dobbins, we saw DeAndre Swift, we saw Cam Akers, after their team's respective bye weeks, come out and take the starting job and take the bull by the horns and completely run away with it. Hopefully, this is going to be the case for Javonte Williams going forward. Melvin Gordon, certainly a tough, other running back to compete with, considering how well he's been playing. But we'll have to keep an eye on it and see how this kind of transpires this week. Moving on to Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard will be inserted more into this offense and be utilized far more, considering, of course, Zeke was a little bit banged up. He did fully participate, not a big deal. But also, with no Amari Cooper and no CeeDee Lamb potentially this week, of course, they're going to have to run the ball even more this upcoming week. Coming off of a game in which he had 7 rushing attempts for 50 yards, 2 catches for 20 yards, 8 fantasy points on only 9 touches, the efficiency for Tony Pollard is always going to be there. I think there's a lot of potential against the Las Vegas Raiders matchup. Again, Mixon, 123 and 2 touchdowns. Darrell Williams, 43 yards on the ground, 101 receiving yards, 9 catches and a touchdown. Devontae Booker, 99 rushing yards, 23 through the air a couple weeks back against this Las Vegas defense, who cannot stop a soul on the ground. Ty Johnson is number 29. I mentioned him as a potential waiver wire pickup as the number 1 specifically at the position because, again, they take on the Houston Texans. The Houston Texans have given up a league-high 4.85 yards per carry to opposing running backs this season. If Ty Johnson is going to be given the opportunity that we anticipate, with Zach Wilson back under center, the offensive line a little bit healthier going forward, Ty Johnson is in line for a great overall performance, specifically because he has the work in the PPR game. He just needs touches on the ground and touchdown opportunity, and he'll be able to have himself a top 29 week. Moving on to David Johnson, playing against the opposite team here, the New York Jets, who are giving up the most points to opposing running backs. This season already, the New York Jets have given up 18 performances of 10-plus fantasy points in the 10 games that they have played. I mean, no other team is even remotely close to giving up I think it was like 33.9 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Not only is David Johnson going to succeed, but other running backs in this backfield may be able to do so. Luckily for David Johnson, Phillip Lindsay was cut earlier today. He has himself opportunity to once again get back into that 15-touch range and get himself some success this upcoming week as they're coming off of a great overall momentum beating the Tennessee Titans, a division rival. Rhamondre Stevenson is the number 31. Again, I mentioned him earlier. If he's only going to be used in garbage time and going to be heavily reliant on game script and scoring touchdowns, well, then we're going to be in a bad position. But in terms of passing the eye test, Rhamondre Stevenson is an extremely talented running back. It's just a matter of whether or not the opportunities are there to sufficiently get him the fantasy points required to be a relevant running back via touchdowns. We'll see how it kind of pans out. Of course, he has himself the ability to catch the ball out of the backfield, which certainly gives him more value going forward, but 31's a safe spot for him. Moving on to 32, Rex Burkhead. Like I mentioned with David Johnson, the easiest matchup of the running back position, 18 total performances of 10-plus fantasy points this season already. Phillip Lindsay's been cut. Rex Burkhead had 18 rushing attempts this last week. Though he wasn't efficient, the total opportunity is all I care about. And as long as he's going to get said opportunity going into this upcoming weekend's matchup, by all means, Rex Burkhead is a guy that I potentially want to have as a flex option. Moving on to Dontrell Hilliard. Hilliard could end up being significantly better than where he currently stands at number 33. Dontrell Hilliard is playing against the New England Patriots. We all know how terrible they are because I talk about it every single week in terms of stopping running backs out of the backfield. This season already, they've given up 73 receptions and 671 receiving yards to opposing running backs. That's number 1 in both categories of statistics against the running back position. they pretty much give up the flat. And that's where, of course, Ryan Tannehill had to go to a lot this last week based on the fact that, of course, A.J. Brown was injured, Julio Jones on the IR, broken foot Derrick Henry, Marcus Johnson, hamstring on the injured reserve now. They had no one else to catch the ball. Of course, a guy like Dontrell Hilliard, who was filling in for Jeremy McNichols, who was inactive, was able to get himself 10-plus targets, 8 catches. Earlier today, Adrian Peterson was waived from the team. Dontrell Hilliard may be the guy that we want to own in this backfield going forward. Moving on, we have Alex Collins as our number 34. I don't really believe in Alex Collins. I believe in the opportunity of a starting running back, an opportunity leading to success. But in terms of a talent, in terms of the matchup, I'm not completely bought in. I think DJ Dallas deserves more opportunities in this backfield, but we'll go ahead and we'll put him here. Be very cautious when approaching, the play of Alex Collins this week. Moving on to Boston Scott. Again, like I mentioned, the running back 2 of this team in the last couple weeks has averaged about 10-plus touches per game. So regardless of Miles Sanders' presence as the number 1, Boston Scott's most likely going to get 10-plus touches because Jordan Howard's out. Kenneth Gainwell's been inactive in the last couple weeks. So why not Boston Scott not only getting himself work on the ground, but the PPR work out of this backfield if it's more of an exciting matchup than we anticipate. Moving on, Tevin Coleman's the last running back that I wanted to mention, taking on the Houston Texans, like I mentioned earlier, with Ty Johnson. The Houston Texans are giving up a league-high 4.85 yards per carry to opposing running backs, with Zach Wilson returning, and the fact that Tevin Coleman actually had more rushing attempts than Ty Johnson this last week, mainly probably because they trust him more in between the tackles. He's a little bit of a bigger running back, but to be honest, I'm not really too convinced on it. I think Tevin Coleman, he's kind of washed up, super injury prone. I think they're better off giving the ball to Ty Johnson, but if they don't know any better because their coaching staff just wants to give him the opportunity for the hell of it, then by all means, we may have an opportunity to find some fantasy value there, but we'll have to wait and see. Either way, thank you everybody for watching. These are our Week 12 running back rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. Rankings are, of course, subject to change. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Click the like button if you have not yet already. Check out Underdog Fantasy and use promo code Andrew today. Of course, play those Thursday night contests the rest of the season. Best ball. There's a lot of fun to be had there. Of course, if you use promo code Andrew, Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. We'll go ahead and continue talking fantasy football tomorrow as I'll present to you guys my top quarterback rankings and wide receivers before the Thursday slate of games. Again, I will be live streaming Thursday morning, 7:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time to 9:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Until then, tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.